Today we're looking at notes
P-2, amplitude changes. So remember the amplitude comes from the absolute value of that A value in front. That's our amplitude. However, similar to all the other parent functions you've dealt with, to graph the graph, you're going to take A and multiply it by your original Y values from your parent function points. So in the directions, for each of the following, graph the parent function and the given function on the same coordinate plane. Use a colored pencil for the parent function. So I'll use my regular pencil for the new graph, and I'll use my red pen for the parent function. So parent function will be in red, and you've noticed I've already put my points, my parent function points in red here. So let's talk about number one, y equals 2 times the sine of x. So remember, the amplitude comes from the absolute value of A. So my A value is 2. The absolute value of 2 is 2. This graph is going to vertically stretch by 2. Okay, so my amplitude is 2. My period is still going to be 2 pi, similar to the parent function, because notice my B value hasn't changed. Okay, it's still 1, and 2 pi times the reciprocal of 1 would be 1, so it's still 2 pi. My domain of this graph, of course, is still going to be negative infinity, positive infinity. It'll go to the left forever, to the right forever. My range, if you think about it, my amplitude is now 2. So this graph is going to go as low as negative 2 and as high as positive 2. So let's talk about our points to graph. So just like you've done with your other parent functions in the past, you're going to take your parent points, you're going to multiply, you're going to keep the x values the same, but you're going to multiply your y values times the a. So 2 times y, or 2y. So I'm going to take my original points, I'm going to keep the x's the same, I'm going to multiply my y values by 2. Of course, 2 times 0 is still 0. Here I'm keeping my x the same, I'm multiplying my y value by 2. Keeping my x the same, multiply the y value by 2. X stays the same, multiply my y value by 2. And then x stays the same, multiply my y value by 2. Okay, so first, let's talk about how high my graph is going to go and how low it's going to go. So 2 is as high as it will go, negative 2 is as low as it will go, just as we talked about here. So when I draw my axis here, I'm going to do up 1, up 2, down 1, down 2. That's as high and as low as I need to go. Of course, since my period is still 2 pi, I'm going to break it up. 1, 2, 3, 4, just as I did with the parent function. So of course, 0 is my first x value, pi over 2 is my second, pi is my third, then 3 pi over 2, and then 2 pi. So of course I'm counting by pi over 2 units each time, increasing. So I've labeled my axes. Now let's go ahead and start plotting. So I'll plot my parent points first. So 0, 0, pi over 2, 1, pi, 0, 3 pi over 2, negative 1, so kind of right there, and then 2 pi, 0. And of course it's going to have that curve to it, do your best, and there we go. So there's the parent graph. Now let's graph the new graph. So 0, 0, pi over 2, 2, pi, 0, 3 pi over 2, negative 2, and 2 pi, 0. So of course the amplitude of this graph is larger, okay? So 2 units here when it's only 1 unit here. Sorry, that's going to bother me a little bit. So there we go. I don't know if that's a whole lot better, but there we go. Okay, so that's number 1. Let's look at number 2. So on number 2, now I'm talking about the cosine graph. So here, these are my original points, parent points for the cosine graph. And I'm going to multiply my y values. My x's will stay the same. My y values will get multiplied by a half, so a half y. So think about what that's going to do. Of course, as you knew from the past, that's going to be a vertical shrink by a half. So my amplitude now is a half. Period is still 2 pi. I don't have, my b value is still the same. B hasn't changed. Okay, my domain is still negative infinity, positive infinity. And of course my range now is going to go as low as negative a half and as high as positive a half. It's shrunk vertically. Okay, so let's look at the points. So my first point would be 0, a half. Remember, I'm multiplying the y values by half. Excuse me. And then pi over 2, 0. Pi, negative a half. 3 pi over 2, still 0, because multiply 0 times a half is still 0. And then 2 pi, comma, a half. So as we predicted here, our amplitude, how high it will go is a half, how low it will go is negative a half. Okay? So labeling our units, we know we need to be able to graph both the parent and the new. So we're going to count by half. So this is a half while this is 1. This is negative a half. This is negative 1. Our period is still the same, so we're still on the x-axis here. We're going to count by pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and then 2 pi. So our parent is 0, 1, pi over 2, 0, pi, negative 1, 3 pi over 2, 0, 2 pi, comma, 1. Okay, so of course, curve, curve, and curve. Okay, and then our new graph, 0, 1/2. Of course, it's been shrunk. And then pi over 2, 0, pi, negative a half. So right there in the middle, sorry. And then 3 pi over 2, 0, and then 2 pi, 1/2. So again, curve, curve, curve. So it goes right through that pi there. Maybe we'll label it. Well, we'll just keep it. Cuts right through, right there. Okay, so you can obviously see that the parent is in red and the new graph is in the pencil. So it definitely has been vertically shrunk. You can see that. All right, so last one here, number 3. Negative 3 times cosine of x. So remember, our amplitude comes from the absolute value of a. So the absolute value of negative 3 is 3. Our period is still 2 pi. B hasn't changed. Okay, our domain is still negative infinity, positive infinity. Now, let's talk about our range. Yes, that's a negative. That will reflect it. But the distance, the vertical distance from the midline is still going to be 3 units down and then 3 units up. So 3 units. So our range is still going to be the same as it would be if this was a positive 3. So negative 3 is how low it's going to go. Positive 3 is how high it's going to go. If you struggle doing this, then wait till you get the points. And obviously you can see from the points how high and how low the graph's going to go. So our points are going to be x, comma, negative 3y. So we have not only a vertical stretch by 3, but also a reflection. So our new points will be 0, comma, negative 3, pi over 2, comma, still 0, pi, comma, positive 3, negative 1 times negative 3 would be positive 3, 3 pi over 2, comma, 0, and 2 pi, comma, negative 3. So again, examine your range and examine the points. How low does this graph go? Negative 3. How high does it end up going? Positive 3. So we were correct. Okay, so I know I need to count off 3 units here. 1, 2, 3. And 3 units here. 1, 2, 3. So 1, 2, 3, negative 1, negative 2, negative 3. Again, my period's still the same, so I'm still going to count by pi over 2. So pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and then 2 pi. Okay, so graphing that parent first, 0, comma 1, pi over 2, 0, pi, negative 1, 3 pi over 2, 0, and 2 pi, comma 1. So doing the best that you can. Whoops, that curve kind of ended up yucky. But there's the parent. Let's talk about the new. So of course our first point is 0, negative 3. And then pi over 2, 0. And then pi, 3, and then 3 pi over 2, 0, and then 2 pi negative 3. So we look a little something like this. Notice, not only have I been vertically stretched, but I've also reflected over that x-axis, as I expected.